guys, welcome back to my channel. I am safetytess, better known as Tess, and today we're going to talk about thrifting, vintage, and antiquing, which are some of my favorite things in the whole world. I had this realization. I was like, there are people in this world that don't just love everything retro. Weird. There are people that go into antique malls and they think everything is cool and they think it's all so old, and I walk in there and I'm like, this is from the 60s, that is so new. Weird. Today I'm going to talk about the 101 in thrifting, antiquing, and vintage. Now, disclaimer, I don't claim to be the perfect thrifter, antiquer, vintage collector, but I come from a collecting family and we have a lot of collections. And we do a lot of things that have to do with antiquing and vintage and thrifting. If this is the first video you're seeing of mine, hi, my name is Tess. I'm a music lifestyle vlogger and I kind of talk about everything retro, so let's get into this. First things first, let's start off with the most affordable and the easiest way to get into your retro loving life, thrifting. Now, I've seen a ton of videos on YouTube called Come Thrifting With Me, and I enjoy these videos so much, but when I watch them, I'm like, guys, these are not thrift stores, these are vintage stores. You're leading me astray with accidental clickbait because you think you're going thrifting, but you're actually not. Now let's get to the background on how thrifting and vintage are different. First off, thrifting is usually a donation-based store. It's like a Goodwill or just a resale shop that's in your town. Consignment stores can also be thrift stores where people buy back clothes, but Buffalo Exchange and stores that resell new clothes is not necessarily what you would call thrifting because you are buying resale, but you're buying it for a higher price. Thrifting is where you're looking for the deal. That's where the name comes from, thrifting. Thrifting can also be considered garage sales because you're going through boxes in front of someone's house and it's like a quarter a piece, so it's definitely thrifting. Now, there are times when thrifting and vintage cross paths, and that's when you find vintage items in a thrift store. It happens all the time. People are like, what is this 80s shirt? I don't need this anymore. Buy it. This moves us on to our next category, which is vintage. Vintage is a store that is dedicated to vintage. There are people that buy vintage for that store and bring it in, and then the vintage stores will buy it from them, or they'll have buyers enlisted for their store, which is a vintage store. Vintage stores also usually cost more because people have taken care of their items, or they get their items cleaned and put on racks and priced and decade, and they put all the time period on them, so they're gonna cost more since they worked on it, which go them. There can also be estate sales. Estate sales are like garage sales, but they're usually of the homes of people that are older or they have more expensive items, so this could be considered vintage as well. Well then, estate sales fall over into our next category. You will get lucky sometimes and you'll get a crossover of like a thrift vintage where they have a surplus of vintage, so their vintage is kind of affordable. But if you're willing to pay like $80 for someone who found you a jumpsuit, you go. But I'm the kind of vintage kid who found one of her favorite dress of all time for $1, and I don't know if I can ever get away from the fact that I found a 1960s dress for $1 that I love so much. So when I see vintage for really high prices, I'm always like, I'll find something else. The last category is antiquing, which is a different category than vintage. You're talking stuff that came out in the 1800s, early 1900s, and this can go up into the 30s is considered an antique. Most of the vintage items I would consider would be 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. But, you know, they all fall into different categories because furniture is pretty much weighed differently than fashion is. But antiquing is also easy to come by. An antique mall is just like a vintage store and it's dedicated to antiques. There are also people who will rent booths in these stores and sell different items, vintage and antique. There's also road shows that you can go to. I go to a road show every year. That's a huge, massive land that's taken over by all these people selling antiques. But they fall into all three categories. So antiquing is like an umbrella term, you know? You could be going antiquing, but you might find yourself getting something that you would consider vintage. Standing in front of my record collection, even though it's not antique. Do I have anything that I could find that's antique right next to me? That's not, see, I would consider this vintage, but it might be considered antique. Let's see, I'll show you. Authentic 1950s. These are literally 50s or early 60s. Sunglasses. I collect vintage sunglasses. See, there's those terms again. I hope this helped you guys understand better a little bit about me and my world of thrifting, vintage, and antiquing. If you'd like to see more videos where I do like thrift hauls or I show you some of my collection, I would love to show you guys. I collect mostly vintage clothes and I wear vintage clothes. I collect records. I collect vintage sunglasses, and most if not all, music memorabilia I can get my hands on. Like one of my favorite things that I own is a little pack of gel that has the Beatles on it. It's Beatles hair gel. I'll show it to you. Thanks so much for watching, guys. If you haven't checked out my Anchor or any of my other social medias, be sure to check them out. They will all be linked down below. But until next time, have a great day, a great night, and a great life. I'll see you very soon. Bye!
It was 99 cents. Copping it, washing it. About to go and get some compliments. Passing up on those moccasins. Someone else has been walking in bummy and grungy fucking man. I am stunting and flossing and saving my money. And I'm hella happy that's a bargain. I'ma take your grandpa style. I'ma take your grandpa style. No, for real. Ask your grandpa. Can I have his hand-me-down? Thank you, Lord.
Vintage is a term used for wine. You could Google it. It doesn't even have like the first definition, something that's over 40 years old. Isn't that weird?